The rain had been falling for 3 days without stopping. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Not the gentle kind that taps at windows and fills gutters with a quiet rushing sound. This was the kind of rain that arrived without apology, the kind that flooded sidewalks and turned alleys into rivers and made the whole city smell like old concrete and rust. It fell on the office towers and the bus shelters and the church steps. And it fell just as hard on the girl huddled beneath the rusted awning of a closed print shop on Marlowe Street. Her knees pulled to her chest, her shoes soaked through, her breath a thin cloud disappearing into the cold. Her name was Mara Ellison. She was 19 years old. She had been sleeping outside for 11 days. She had a backpack with a broken zipper held shut with a safety pin, a library card she had found on the sidewalk 3 weeks ago, 41 cents in her coat pocket, and a paperback copy of a novel she had read so many times the spine had cracked down the middle and the pages had begun to separate from the binding like leaves loosening from a branch at the end of autumn. She had a mother who had stopped answering the phone. She had a caseworker whose voicemail was always full. She had memories of a small apartment on the east side where she had lived until she was 16, when everything fell apart the way things tend to fall apart quietly at first, and then all at once. What she did not have was a place to go. She had been watching the library for 2 days before she went inside. It sat at the corner of Marlowe and Aldene, half a block from the print shop, a building that looked as though the city had simply forgotten about it. 3 stories of pale limestone, the kind of stone that holds on to cold and gives it back slowly. Iron letters above the entrance spelled out Aldene Public Library, though the D had slipped to one side sometime in the past decade, and no one had bothered to straighten it. The steps were cracked down the center. The 2 large windows on either side of the door were still intact, but filmed with grime so old it had turned gray, and through them you could make out nothing more than shapes, the vague dark forms of shelves, a ceiling light somewhere inside burning the tired amber of a bulb that had been on too long. A laminated notice was taped to the door. Reduced hours it read, and then below, in smaller letters, due to funding review, followed by a phone number Mara was certain no one answered. The city had been talking about closing Aldene for 4 years. She had read about it once in a discarded newspaper, a small article near the back of the metro section. Aldene branch faces 3rd consecutive year of funding shortfall. 32 patrons visited in the month of October. Mara had read that number and thought about it for a long time. 32 people in 31 days. Sometimes she went an entire day in the city without anyone looking directly at her. She understood what it felt like to exist without being counted. On the 3rd morning of rain, when the cold had moved past discomfort and begun to feel genuinely dangerous, she climbed the cracked steps and pushed open the door. The smell hit her first. Books and dust and the particular warm stillness of a room that has been sealed against the weather. It was not an unpleasant smell. It was, in fact, one of the best smells she had ever encountered, because beneath the dust and the paper and the old binding glue was something she had not felt in 11 days. Warmth. The building was heated, barely, but heated. The front room was not large. A circulation desk stood at the center, unmanned. Behind it, shelves ran in rows toward the back wall, labeled in hand-lettered cardboard signs. Fiction, biography, history, reference, children. The labeling system had clearly been maintained by one person for a very long time. The handwriting on all the signs identical, a careful, slightly old-fashioned cursive. A few of the bulbs overhead had burned out and not been replaced, leaving the back half of the room in a pleasant dimness. 2 wooden tables with mismatched chairs occupied one corner near the window. A corkboard near the door held flyers for events from several months ago. A space heater hummed quietly behind the circulation desk. Mara stood just inside the door and looked at all of it, and did not move for almost a full minute. Then a voice said, from somewhere she had not expected, "Close the door behind you, please. The heat escapes." She turned. There was a woman seated in a chair beside the space heater, half hidden by a shelving unit, with a book open in her lap and reading glasses on the end of her nose. She was perhaps 70, perhaps older, with white hair pinned back in a knot and a cardigan so thick it looked more like a small blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She had the face of someone who had decided long ago not to be surprised by very much. "Sorry," Mara said, and let the door swing shut behind her. The woman looked at her over the top of her glasses. Not the way most people looked at Mara lately, with the quick downward assessment that ended in looking away. She looked at her the way a person looks at something they are genuinely trying to understand. "You look like you've been standing in the rain," the woman said. "I have," Mara said. "There are paper towels in the bathroom," the woman said, returning her gaze to her book. "Shelf 4 has the driest chair in the building, if you need to sit." Her name was Eugenia Carr. She had worked at Aldene branch for 41 years, first as a circulation assistant, then as head librarian. The library had been threatened with closure so many times she had stopped keeping count. Each time, she said, it had survived through some combination of letters to the city council, modest community donations, and what she described without irony as sheer stubbornness. She told Mara all of this over the course of the next several hours, not in a continuous flow, but in small pieces, offered the way a person offers something valuable when they have decided you can be trusted with it. She asked Mara very few questions, and the ones she asked plainly, without the careful softness that was really another kind of pity. Where had she been sleeping? How long? Did she have family in the city? Mara answered plainly in return. Outside. 11 days. No. Eugenia absorbed this without visible reaction. Then she went to a cabinet behind the circulation desk, took out a wool blanket that appeared to have lived there for some time, and set it on the table nearest the space heater. "The library closes at 6, she said. "I generally leave at 6:15. She returned to her chair and her book and said nothing else. Mara sat at the table, wrapped herself in the blanket, and stayed until 6:15. When Eugenia rose to leave, she put on a coat and scarf and hat with the methodical patience of someone who had been fighting cold weather their entire life, and then she paused at the door. "I open at 9, she said. "The door sometimes sticks in cold weather. Knock twice at the bottom, it loosens the frame." She left. Mara stood in the cold lobby for a moment longer, listening to the space heater tick as it cooled, feeling the warmth already beginning to thin. Then she went back out into the rain. She came back the next morning at 9. She knocked twice at the bottom of the door. It opened. Over the weeks that followed, a quiet arrangement took shape, the kind that is never spoken aloud because putting it into words might make it fragile. Mara came when the library opened and stayed until it closed. In the hours between, she read. She read everything, novels and histories and biographies and thick reference books that smelled of old adhesive. She read things she did not understand, and then found other books that helped her understand them. She had always been a reader, even before, back in the apartment on the east side, when there had been a small shelf of paperbacks in the hallway that she had worked through by the time she was 12. Reading was the one thing that had survived intact from that earlier version of her life. She also began to help. It started because there were boxes. Eugenia mentioned, without asking, that several donations had arrived and the boxes needed to be sorted. Mara sorted them. Then she noticed the card catalog was missing several dozen entries, and she began adding them. Then one afternoon a water pipe behind the back wall began making a sound that was clearly not right, and Mara crawled behind the shelving unit and tightened the connection with a pair of pliers she found in the utility closet, a skill she had learned at 16 from a neighbor who had taken intermittent pity on her family's series of minor household disasters. Eugenia watched all of this with the same expression she seemed to apply to most things, a careful, considering attention that did not tip into praise or disapproval. "You're useful," she said one afternoon. "I'm grateful," Mara said. "Those are not the same thing," Eugenia said, "but they can coexist." The library was a stranger building the more Mara came to know it. It had been built in 1921. She learned from a framed photograph near the front door, which showed the original structure, smaller than the current one, surrounded by a neighborhood that no longer existed. An addition had been added in 1947 and another in 1968, and the result was a building that did not quite match itself from one end to the other. The floors changed levels slightly between sections. The ceilings varied in height. The light in certain rooms arrived from unexpected angles. She spent the first few weeks in the front rooms. Then she began to explore deeper, past the reference section, past the back shelves, through a narrow corridor she had initially mistaken for a storage passage. This opened into a room she had not known existed, a small reading room with a fireplace that had not been used in decades, for armchairs in varying states of deterioration, and floor-to-ceiling shelves on 3 walls. The fourth wall was paneled in dark wood. She brought this discovery to Eugenia. "The Harwick Room," Eugenia said. "Who's Harwick?" Mara asked. Eugenia set down her pen. "That," she said, "is a longer story." She told it in pieces over several days, the way she told most things. Arthur Harwick had been the founding donor of Aldene Branch, not the city, not a government institution, but one man who had, in 1921, given the building and its original collection to the community of the Aldene neighborhood. He had been a book dealer and a collector, a quiet man of significant private wealth who had never married, never sought public recognition, and left almost no personal record beyond the library itself and a brief letter filed with the city archive. He had died in 1931 and left no heirs. The library had passed to the city's management after his death, and in the decades since, almost everything about him had been quietly forgotten. "What happened to his collection?" Mara asked. Eugenia was quiet for a moment. "That," she said, "is the part no one has ever been able to answer with any certainty." Harwick had been known in his lifetime as a collector of rare books, manuscripts, and documents. His personal collection had never been cataloged publicly. When he died, the library's records mentioned a collection that was to be maintained in a separate room, the Harwick Room, but subsequent records made no further reference to it. The shelves in the room, Mara had already observed, held mostly ordinary volumes, donated titles from the 1970s and 1980s, exactly the kind of books you would find abandoned on any library's back shelf. People assumed it was dispersed, Eugenia said, or that the original inventory had been exaggerated. "You don't think so?" Mara said. Eugenia looked at her steadily. "I think there are rooms inside this building that the renovation crews in 1968 built around rather than through. I think there are things in this library that have not been looked at in a very long time." She paused. "I also think that I am 73 years old and have bad knees, and I have never had the right help to look properly." Mara understood what was being offered. That night, instead of leaving at 6:15, she stayed. She told Eugenia she would sleep in the reading room if that was all right. Eugenia said nothing for a moment, then went to the cabinet behind the desk and took out a second blanket, older than the first, and set it on the table. "There's a kettle in the back office," she said. "And tea." She left. Mara listened to the door close and the key turn in the lock, and then the building was hers. She lay on the floor of the Harwick Room with the blanket pulled up to her chin and looked at the ceiling, which was lower here than in the front rooms, and she thought about Arthur Harwick, a man who had built something and then died and been forgotten, a man who had believed that books were worth giving everything you had to give. She thought about what it meant to leave something behind for people you would never meet, in a building you would never see used, for reasons that no single letter could adequately explain. She thought about the paneled wall. It was not the same as the other walls in the room. She had noticed it the first day without fully naming what she had noticed. The wood was the same age, the same dark stain, but the paneling was thicker, and at one end, near the floor, there was a gap between two panels that was not present anywhere else. Not large, perhaps the width of a fingernail, but consistent, running the full height of the panel, straight and clean in a way that settling wood and age do not produce naturally. She got up at 2 in the morning and went to look at it again. She pressed her fingers to the edge of the gap and felt that it did not give. Then she pressed the panel itself and found a section near the center that moved, not swung, not opened, just depressed slightly under pressure, like a button waiting to be found. She pressed harder. Nothing happened. She stood back and looked at the whole panel for a long time. Then she went to the shelves on the adjacent wall. Eugenia had mentioned that in old buildings, in rooms meant to be private, the access mechanisms were sometimes disguised as ordinary objects. She had said this in the context of something she had read, a history of Victorian architecture, and had not been talking about the Harwick Room specifically. But Mara had listened to the way she said it. She began looking at the books on the shelf nearest the paneled wall. Most were generic, the kind of donated paperbacks that no longer matched the context of the room. But at the end of the second shelf from the bottom, pressed against the wall, was a single volume that was not like the others. Dark cloth cover, no title on the spine. She pulled it out. It was not a book. It was weighted, solid, the exterior shaped like a book, but the interior, when she opened it, revealed a small iron mechanism, a lever fitted into a brass housing, old and precise and very deliberately made. She held it for a long moment. Then she put it back on the shelf in exactly the position she had found it, and sat down. Because she understood something in that moment that she had not understood before. She was a girl who had been sleeping outside for 11 days before she found this building. She had nothing, no family, no address, no legal standing, no claim on anything in the world except the safety pin holding her backpack shut and the cracked paperback in her pocket. She had been allowed into this building by an old woman who had given her a blanket and a cup of tea and the space to exist without being explained. What was on the other side of that panel was not hers to find alone. She put the blanket back over herself and lay down and stared at the ceiling until dawn. When Eugenia arrived at 9 the next morning, Mara was at the circulation desk. She had made tea. She had 2 cups ready. She set one in front of Eugenia without saying anything. Eugenia took it, looked at her, and sat down. "Tell me," Eugenia said. Mara told her. Eugenia listened without interrupting. When Mara finished, Eugenia set down her cup and looked at the hallway toward the back of the building for a long time. Her expression was not surprise. It was the expression of someone who has been waiting a long time to hear a specific sentence and is now quietly absorbing the fact that they have finally heard it. "Show me," she said. They walked to the Harwick Room together. Mara showed her the gap in the panel, the depression near the center, the false book on the second shelf. Eugenia looked at each thing with a methodical attention that was also, Mara thought, a kind of restraint, the practiced discipline of a person who has learned not to reach for things before they are ready to be reached for. She picked up the false book and turned the lever once, slowly. The panel did not swing. It did not fall. It slid, smoothly and silently, to the left, on a mechanism so well maintained that it moved with an ease that belonged to a different era, when things were built to last centuries rather than decades. Beyond it was a doorway, and beyond the doorway was a room. The smell that came from it was old and dry and very still, the smell of a place that has been untouched for a very long time. Not rot, not decay, because whatever had been done to seal and preserve this room had been done carefully. Just age. The compound scent of time at rest. Eugenia looked at Mara. Mara looked at Eugenia. "The kettle," Eugenia said, "is going to have to wait." They went in. The room was not large. Perhaps 12 feet by 14, with a ceiling lower than the reading room. The walls were shelved from floor to ceiling, as in the reading room, but these shelves were different. They were built of heavier wood, fitted with glass panels on hinges that could be latched shut, and behind the glass were books, dozens, perhaps more than 100, standing in careful rows. Not donated paperbacks, not ordinary volumes. Even in the dim light from the single bulb Mara had found and screwed into the ceiling socket, she could see they were old. Very old. Some had spines of leather in deep reds and greens and blacks, the lettering pressed in gold leaf. Others were in protective cases of a pale material she could not immediately identify. In the center of the room was a reading table, small and plain, with 2 chairs. On the table was a single item, a wooden box, about the size of a shoebox, sealed shut with a simple brass clasp. On the lid of the box, someone had pressed into the wood with a metal stamp a single sentence. "For whoever finds this room, when the time is right." Mara stood at the threshold for a moment, then stepped inside. The floor was solid beneath her. The shelves were immovable, bolted to the walls. The glass panels on the cases were intact. Everything had been sealed with the intention that it would survive, and it had. She moved along the shelves slowly, reading the spines where she could make them out. Many of the titles were in Latin. Others were in English, so old the spelling was unfamiliar. One case held what appeared to be scrolls, bound in pale ribbon. Another held a collection of flat items that might have been maps. She turned to look at Eugenia, who had remained at the threshold. The old woman's face was doing something complicated. It was the face of someone confronting the thing they have spent 41 years half believing in and half dismissing. The thing that has kept them in a building the city keeps threatening to close. The thread of possibility they have pulled gently and then released, year after year, because they were not sure they were ready to pull it all the way through. "Eugenia," Mara said gently. Eugenia stepped inside. They opened the wooden box together. Inside was a letter, handwritten on paper that had been folded and refolded many times, sealed in a glassine envelope. Below the letter was a key, iron, old, with a specific and deliberate shape. And below the key, at the bottom of the box, was a document. Not handwritten. Printed, on paper that appeared to be legal stock, covered in formal language, with a seal pressed at the bottom and a signature above the seal. Mara lifted out the letter first, still in its envelope. She turned it over. On the back, in the same careful handwriting that appeared on all of Eugenia's shelf labels, was a single line. She read it twice to be certain she had understood it. Then she read it aloud, because Eugenia's reading glasses were in the other room, and she could not make it out. It said, "If you are reading this, the library still stands, which means the right person found it at the right time. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one." The letter inside the envelope was dated October 14th, 1929, 2 years before Harwick's death, and 2 years after the great crash that had reordered the financial world for a generation. It was not written to any specific person. It was written, as the box's inscription suggested, to whoever found it. Mara read it aloud in the half-dark of the sealed room, standing beside an old woman she had known for 4 weeks, in a library that the city had been trying to close for 4 years. She read slowly, because the handwriting was precise but took concentration, and because the words themselves seemed to require space. Arthur Harwick began with a simple statement. He had come to the Aldene neighborhood in 1914 as a young man with a modest income and in a modest collection of books, and the neighborhood had given him more than he had ever given it, which was why, when he had the means, he had tried to give something back. He wrote about the library in the way a person writes about a child, with a combination of pride and apprehension, the awareness that what you have made will outlive you and may become something different from what you intended. He wrote about his collection. He had spent 30 years acquiring rare books, manuscripts, illuminated texts, early printed volumes, and items he had been advised were among the finest of their kind in private hands in the country. He had refused to sell them, and he had refused to donate them to institutions he did not trust to keep them accessible to ordinary people. Instead, he had done something that his lawyers had told him was unusual to the point of eccentricity. He had sealed them in this room. He wrote that he had arranged for the collection to be assessed and inventoried by a man he trusted, a book dealer named Reese, who had given his opinion of their value in a document that was also in this room. He had then established a legal arrangement, described in the document at the bottom of the box, which was a modified version of a trust instrument. Under this arrangement, the collection would remain the property of the library in perpetuity, not to be sold or dispersed, unless the library was at genuine risk of permanent closure, in which case the collection could be liquidated to fund its continuation or to endow its replacement. He had built into the trust a specific condition. The person who opened this room, who found the hidden mechanism and had the good sense to understand what they had found, was to be considered the trust's executor. Not an institution, not a city agency. A person, the one who was here when the room was finally opened. He wrote, "I do not know who you are. I do not know when you will find this. I believe you are finding it because you needed to find it, because people come to libraries when they need something, and sometimes what they need is bigger than the thing they came looking for. I hope the collection is of use. I hope the library stands." He signed it simply. A.H. Mara set the letter down. The room was very quiet. Outside the sealed walls, the building made the small sounds that old buildings make, the tick of pipes, the faint argument of wind against stone. Somewhere in the city beyond those walls, the rain was still falling, though she had not been outside to check. She thought about 11 days on the street and a safety pin holding a broken zipper shut. She thought about 41 cents in a coat pocket and a library card found on a sidewalk and a paperback with a broken spine. She thought about a woman who had handed her a blanket without requiring an explanation. She looked at Eugenia. Eugenia was looking at the shelves. Her expression had settled into something Mara did not have an immediate word for. Not joy exactly. Not relief exactly. Something beneath both of those things. The look of a person who has spent a very long time being faithful to something uncertain and has just been told that the uncertainty was, all along, a kind of promise. "We need to tell someone," Mara said. "Yes," Eugenia agreed. She did not move. In a moment, she moved to the nearest shelf and placed one hand, very carefully, against the glass panel. She stood like that for a long moment, looking at the books behind the glass. Then she turned. "First," she said, "we read the document." They read it together, Mara holding the paper and Eugenia reading over her shoulder. It was dense with legal language, but its substance was clear enough. The collection held in the sealed room of the Aldene Public Library, as described and inventoried by Daniel Reese on the dates listed, was to be held in trust for the benefit of the library and its community. In the event that the library faced permanent closure, the trust executor could authorize liquidation for the library's benefit. Attached, in a separate envelope clipped to the back of the document, was the inventory. 4 pages, single-spaced, describing items by title, date, condition, and the assessor's estimate of value. The estimates were in $1927. Mara read down the columns slowly. Then she stopped. She read one line again. Then she looked up at Eugenia. "These estimates," she said carefully. "They're from 1927. "Yes," Eugenia said. "Things change value." "Yes," Eugenia said. "Some things go up by a lot." "Yes," Eugenia said. Mara set the inventory page on the table. She looked at it for a moment. Then she said, very quietly, "We need to call someone. Not the city. A book dealer. Someone who knows what things like this are worth now." Eugenia looked at her for a long time with the expression of a person who has already done the same mental calculation and has been waiting to see if the other person arrived at the same place. "I know a man," she said. "He's retired. He used to teach at the university. He won't laugh." "Good," Mara said. "Call him." She picked up the inventory page again and looked at it in the thin light of the bare bulb overhead. The items described were not abstract to her. She had been reading for 4 weeks in this building, and she had spent time in the past week reading histories of rare books and manuscripts. Following a thread she could not entirely explain, some pull toward understanding the context of the place she had been given shelter. She knew enough now to understand what some of these items were. Not perfectly, not professionally, but enough. The names on the list, the dates, the descriptions. She thought about what the man had written in his letter. "I do not know who you are. I do not know when you will find this." She thought about all the things she did not have. No family, no address, no history anyone was keeping track of. She was a girl who had fallen through every net the city extended, and who had knocked on the bottom of a library door in the rain, and who had been given a blanket and a cup of tea and the space to exist. Arthur Harwick had written that the person who found the room was to be considered the trust's executor. She did not know what that meant exactly, in legal terms. She did not know what would happen next, or what was required of her, or how long it would take. She knew almost nothing about how any of this worked. But she was beginning to understand something she had not allowed herself to think in 11 days of sleeping outside and 41 years of Eugenia's careful faithfulness. She was beginning to understand that sometimes the things that have been waiting the longest are waiting for the most specific person. Not the most qualified, not the most powerful, the most specific. The girl who knocked twice at the bottom of the door because someone told her the cold loosened the frame. The woman who had kept the heat on in a library that no one was visiting, because she could not imagine what the neighborhood would be without it. Neither of them had been waiting for rescue. They had both, in their different ways, simply refused to leave. And sometimes that is enough to open a sealed room. Mara folded the inventory page and held it in both hands. The iron key from the box lay on the table between them. She did not know yet what it opened. She suspected there was more to find. She had read Harwick's letter carefully, and he was the kind of man who planned in layers. But that was for tomorrow. Tonight she sat in a room full of things that had been waiting 100 years, with a woman who had been faithful for 41 of them, and she let herself feel, for the first time in a very long while, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Outside, the rain was finally beginning to stop. The city did not know yet what had been found. The building was still dark from the outside, still filmed with grime, still bearing a sign above the door where the D had slipped to one side. The steps were still cracked down the center. To anyone passing on Marlowe Street, it looked exactly as it had always looked. Forgotten, unimportant. But inside, in a room that had been sealed for nearly a century, 2 women sat beside a wooden box and a collection of things that the world did not know existed, and the silence around them was not the silence of emptiness. His name was Leonard Foss, and he arrived the following morning in a coat that had seen better decades, carrying a leather satchel and a magnifying loupe on a cord around his neck, and he stood in the doorway of the Harwick Room for almost 2 full minutes before he said a single word. Eugenia had called him the previous evening. Mara had listened from across the circulation desk, watching the old woman's face as she spoke, the careful economy of what she said, the way she did not reach for drama or urgency. She simply told him what they had found, as plainly as she might have told him the weather. When she hung up, she said only that he would come in the morning, and then she had gone back to the cabinet behind the desk and made tea, and they had sat together in the warm amber light of the building until it was late enough to sleep, and neither of them had said very much at all. There are moments that are too large for conversation. You can feel them pressing at the edges of ordinary language and understand that words, for once, are not the right instrument. This was one of those moments. They both seemed to know it. So they sat, and they drank their tea, and outside the rain finally finished what it had started 3 days ago and moved on, and the city settled into the specific quiet of a night after long rain, when the gutters are still running but the air has cleared, and everything smells like wet stone and the beginning of something different. Leonard Foss had taught the history of the book at the university for 32 years before his retirement, and before that he had worked for 20 years as a specialist in rare manuscripts and early printed texts for an auction house in the city. He was not a man who was easily surprised. Mara had formed this impression within the first 30 seconds of his arrival, from the way he moved through the library, the way his eyes cataloged things without appearing to catalog them, the slight but perceptible shift in his posture when he had passed through the front room and the fiction stacks and the reference section and arrived in the corridor that led to the back. He could feel it, she thought, the way you can sometimes feel a room before you enter it. When Eugenia slid the panel back with the lever from the false book, Leonard Foss looked at the mechanism for a moment, then looked at the darkness beyond the doorway, then looked at Eugenia with an expression that was not quite reverence and not quite hunger, but something in between, the look of a man confronting the thing he has spent his professional life learning to recognize. He went inside. For the next hour, he moved through the sealed room with the deliberate, unhurried attention of a surgeon. He did not touch anything without first looking at it for a long time. He opened the glass cases one by one, only far enough to examine the spines or lift the edge of a cover with gloved hands he had produced from the leather satchel. He used the loop. He murmured occasionally, not to Mara or Eugenia, but to himself, in the half-articulate language of a specialist working through something complex. Mara stood near the door and watched. She had slept badly the night before, which was not unusual. She had spent the hours before sleep lying on the floor of the reading room thinking about the inventory page and the figures written there in $1927 and running rough calculations in her head, the kind of calculations that felt almost irresponsible to perform because the numbers they produced were so far outside anything she had ever inhabited that they did not feel real. They felt like the kind of numbers that existed in other people's lives, in other categories of human experience entirely. But she had done the calculations anyway, because she was the kind of person who needed to know things precisely, even when the precision was frightening. And now she watched Leonard Foss move through the room, and she watched his face, and she waited. He spent the longest time at the far shelf, the one nearest the back wall. He opened that case and stood before it for a very long while, occasionally using the loop, occasionally tilting his head to a specific angle, occasionally being entirely still. When he finally closed the case and latched it, he turned around, and his face had changed. "Eugenia," he said. His voice was level, but something beneath the level surface of it was not. "Yes," she said. "How long has this library been under threat of closure?" "The most recent formal review has been running for 14 months, Eugenia said. "The one before that ran for 2 years. We survived both. And the city is unaware of this room. As far as I know." Leonard Foss nodded slowly. He looked at Mara. "You found it?" "Yes," Mara said. "How?" She told him briefly. "The panel, the gap at the edge, the false book on the second shelf." He listened without interrupting. "And you are," he said. "A patron," Eugenia said, before Mara could answer. The word, offered in Eugenia's plain, unembellished way, carried more weight than any longer description would have. A patron. Someone who uses a library. Someone the library is for. Leonard Foss looked at Mara for a moment longer. Then he moved to the reading table in the center of the room and set his satchel down and opened it and removed a notepad and a pen. "All right," he said. "I'm going to need to work through the full inventory against what's actually here. That will take the better part of the day. You should both eat something. This is going to be a long conversation." If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. It took him 6 hours. Mara went to the small bakery 2 blocks from the library and spent 31 of her 41 cents on a bread roll, which she ate on the steps outside in the cold morning air, watching the street dry out from the previous night's rain. When she came back inside, Eugenia had made tea, and they sat at the table in the reading room, while Leonard Foss worked in the sealed room beyond the open panel. Occasionally, he came out to look something up in the reference section, moving through the stacks with the confident speed of someone who had spent decades in libraries and did not need to look at the signs. He never told them what he was finding. He simply worked. By early afternoon, the notepad had been filled, and he had begun a second one. The light in the reading room shifted as the day moved, the amber of morning giving way to the flatter light of midday, and then the beginning of the slow gold of afternoon. At 4 o'clock, he came out of the sealed room and sat down in the chair across from them. He set both notepads on the table. He looked at his hands for a moment. Then he looked up. "I want to tell you what is in that room," he said. "And I want you to understand that everything I am about to say is based on a preliminary examination. Full authentication and appraisal will require specialists, more time, controlled conditions. What I am giving you now is my best professional judgment after 40 years in this field, and you should treat it as an expert opinion rather than a final determination." He paused. "But I want you to also understand that in 40 years, my expert opinion has rarely been significantly wrong." Eugenia said nothing. Mara said nothing. He opened the first notepad to a page near the middle. The collection in that room numbers 114 individual items. Not all of them are of equal significance. 37 of them are what I would classify as historically interesting but not exceptional, the kind of thing a serious collector acquires along the way, worth money but not remarkable money. Another 22 are genuinely rare, items I would be pleased to find anywhere, pieces that belong in well-funded private collections or good university libraries. He turned a page. The remaining 55 items are something else. He was quiet for a moment. Arthur Harwick, he said carefully, was not merely a collector. He was one of the great collectors of the early 20th century, and he was one who had the particular advantage of operating before the market for what he was acquiring was fully understood. He bought things when people did not yet know they should be competed for. He bought things from estates that did not understand what they had. He bought things through connections in Europe during the period between the wars, when old institutions were dissolving and their contents were dispersed. And then he put everything in a room and sealed it and said nothing. He looked at the notepad again. On the third shelf from the top of the left case, there is a manuscript. Vellum, bound in boards, dated from the colophon to the early 14th century. It is a copy of a text I recognized immediately, a text that exists in only 4 other known copies, all of which are in major institutional collections. The last time a copy came to market was 1981. It sold for what was then considered an extraordinary sum. The market for manuscripts of this period and rarity has not moved backward since 1981. He set the notepad down. On the shelf beside it is an early printed book, Incunabulum, pre-1500. I will not pretend certainty about which edition without more time and equipment, but I know what I think it is. If I am right, there is one other copy in private hands in the world. The last institutional acquisition of a comparable item occurred at private negotiation, and the figure was not disclosed publicly, but I have colleagues who were involved in that transaction, and I know what the number was. He picked up the second notepad. On the bottom shelf of the right case, there is a collection of maps. I counted 17. The earliest appears to date from the late 15th century. 3 of them I can identify as belonging to a cartographic tradition that I have only seen in major European archives. 2 of them I cannot immediately identify at all, which in my experience means they are either insignificant or extraordinary. And nothing else in this room has been insignificant. He closed the notepad. The reading room was very quiet. Outside, a bus moved along the street, its engine a low rumble that faded quickly. "Give me a number," Mara said. Leonard Foss looked at her. "A range," she said. "Your best estimate, given everything you've told me." He was quiet for a long moment. He was the kind of man who did not offer numbers carelessly. She could see that, the kind of man for whom an estimate was a commitment, and a commitment was not made lightly. "The 37 ordinary items," he said finally, would sell at auction for somewhere between $400,000 and $700,000 in total, depending on the market and the presentation. He paused. The 22 genuinely rare items would bring somewhere between $2 and $4 million in total, again, depending on conditions. Another pause. The remaining 55 items, he said, I cannot give you a precise number for without full authentication. But if my identifications are correct, and I believe they are, the combined value of those 55 items is not less than $280 million. It may be considerably more. He let the number sit. Mara had known it was coming. She had run the calculations in her head the night before, imprecisely, without his knowledge, without seeing the items herself, from the description in the 1927 inventory and her own reading about what certain categories of rare books and manuscripts had done in value over a century. She had arrived at a figure in the same rough territory. Knowing it was coming did not make it easier to absorb. She looked at Eugenia. Eugenia was looking at the table. Her hands were folded in her lap, and she was very still, the way she was still when she was reading something carefully, taking it in rather than reacting to it. After a moment, Eugenia looked up. The trust document, she said to Leonard. Mara has shown it to you. Yes, I read it this morning. And the executor provision. Yes. Eugenia looked at Mara. You understand what this means. Mara understood. She had understood since the night before, sitting in the amber light with her tea, running numbers in her head. She had understood and had not quite allowed herself to believe it, because belief required a different kind of courage than calculation. The library doesn't have to close, she said. No, Eugenia said. It does not. They sat with that for a moment. Then Eugenia said, with the same calm plainness she applied to everything, we will need a lawyer. What followed was not simple. Nothing that involves old money and legal documents and municipal institutions and the interests of people who would prefer certain outcomes is ever simple. But it also moved faster than Mara expected, which she came to understand was a function of the specific, extraordinary nature of what had been found. The lawyer Eugenia found was a woman named Patricia Home, who ran a small practice 3 blocks from the library and had been a patron since she was a child and had a particular interest in trust law. She came to the library on a Saturday, examined the documents in the sealed room, and spent 2 hours on her phone making calls before she set it down and told them what they needed to know. The trust was legitimate. The instrument Harwick had used was unusual but legally sound, a variant of a perpetual charitable trust combined with a personal executor provision that gave broad authority to the named executor for decisions about the collection's use or liquidation. The fact that the executor was not named by person but by circumstance, the one who opens the room, was eccentric but not invalid, particularly given the supporting documentation that established the intent clearly. The executor, under this instrument, was Mara Ellison, not Eugenia, who had been faithful to the building for 41 years, not Leonard Foss, who had the expertise to understand what the room contained, not the city, which had been managing the library's slow strangulation for decades, the girl with the broken zipper and the library card she had found on the sidewalk. Mara sat with this for a long time after Patricia Home explained it. She sat with it the way you sit with something that changes the shape of the world you have been living in, carefully, holding very still, afraid that if you move too quickly, you will tip something important. She did not feel like an executor. She did not feel like someone to whom $300 million had just been entrusted. She felt like herself, 19 years old, backpack with a safety pin, 41 cents, paperback with a broken spine. The self did not transform just because the circumstances had. But she thought about what Eugenia had given her. Not the blanket, not the tea, not the technically looking the other way while a homeless girl slept on the reading room floor. Something larger. The space to exist without being explained. The assumption, quiet and steady as a held door, that she was a person and not a problem, that she was worth the heat and the time and the 2 paper towels in the bathroom and the best chair on the 4th shelf. She thought about what the trust document said, written in 1929 by a man who had never met her and never would. A man who had believed that the person who found the room would be the right person for the room. Not because they were qualified, because they were there, because something had brought them there, and they had had the good sense to look at what was in front of them rather than past it. She thought about 32 patrons in the month of October. She thought about a library that was going to close. She went to find Patricia Home, and told her she was ready. The first challenge was the city. When word reached the appropriate municipal offices that a significant collection had been discovered in a branch library that was currently under funding review, the response was not what Mara would have naively expected. It was not celebration. It was not gratitude. It was, almost immediately, a set of competing legal arguments about the ownership of the collection, the validity of the trust instrument, the city's rights as the managing entity of the building, and the question of whether a trust executed in 1931, before the city had formally assumed management of the library, could legally bind the city to conditions established by a private individual. These arguments were made by lawyers in offices Mara had never been in language she was still learning, with a speed and organization that suggested they had been anticipating something like this, or at least had protocols for this category of unexpected problem. Patricia Home was not surprised. She had been expecting it. The city's position, she explained to Mara and Eugenia at the table in the reading room, papers spread between them, is that they are the legal steward of the building and its contents, and therefore any significant asset discovered within the building falls under their authority. This is a reasonable position, and they will find lawyers willing to argue it convincingly. But it is wrong, Eugenia said. It is contestable, Patricia said carefully, which is different from wrong, legally speaking. Harwick transferred the building to the city in 1931 with specific conditions attached. The trust instrument postdates that transfer, but it was filed with the deed and the conditions were part of the transfer terms. Whether those conditions survive the various administrative transfers the library has undergone since then is the question. And, Mara said. Patricia looked at her steadily. I believe they survived. I believe the trust is valid and the executor provision is enforceable. But belief and a legal ruling are not the same thing, and obtaining the ruling will take time. How much time? I don't know. Months, at minimum. More likely over a year. Mara thought about this. She thought about the library's current funding situation, the review that had been running for 14 months, the fact that the city's interest in acquiring or closing the library had not diminished simply because a collection had been found inside it. In fact, she suspected it had intensified. What happens to the library while we wait? She asked. Patricia was quiet for a moment. The funding review continues on its existing timeline. The collection remains sealed. Nothing can be moved or liquidated until the legal question is resolved. So we could win the argument about the trust and still lose the library, Mara said. Yes, Patricia said. That is a possibility. Mara looked at the ceiling for a moment. She thought about 11 days on the street. She thought about the way things you needed could disappear before you had finished needing them, and how there was no argument you could make to the cold that would make it wait. What can we do while we wait? She said. Patricia looked at her with something that might have been approval. We can make the case publicly. The trust document is a matter of record, and the existence of the collection, once the city has been formally notified, becomes public information. We can tell the story. Tell it to whom? To everyone. What Mara had not anticipated, because she had no framework for anticipating it, was what happened when a story like this one met the specific moment in which they were living. It began with Leonard Foss, who called a colleague at the university, who called a colleague at a newspaper, who called a junior reporter who had been looking for exactly this kind of story for exactly this moment in her career. The reporter came to the library on a Wednesday and spent 4 hours with Mara and Eugenia, and the story she wrote was careful and specific and did not oversell anything, which was why it was more convincing than a story that did. She described the building. She described Eugenia's 41 years. She described the hidden room and the wooden box and the letter from 1929. She quoted Leonard Foss's preliminary assessment, with all his professional caveats intact. And she described Mara, without sentimentality but without cruelty, in the precise terms of her actual situation, 19 years old, no fixed address, for weeks in a library that the city was considering closing, the person who had found what no one else had found. The story ran on a Thursday morning. By Thursday afternoon, Mara's phone, which was a second-hand device she had acquired 3 weeks earlier with the help of a social services connection Eugenia had quietly arranged, had received more calls than it had received in its entire previous existence. They came from journalists, from professors, from collectors, from members of the public who had read the story and felt something they could not immediately articulate, but needed to express. They came from people who had grown up using the Aldene branch library and had not been back in 20 years and were now very strongly of the opinion that it should not be closed. They came from a lawyer in another city who specialized in charitable trust litigation and had opinions about the city's legal position. They came from 2 television stations. They did not, notably, come from the city council. The city council, Mara learned from Patricia Home, was in an emergency internal meeting on Thursday afternoon, which she gathered was not a coincidence. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The character who emerged from the coverage, the one Mara had not engineered or intended, was not a victim. She had been afraid, reading the first draft of the article, that the story would be told in a way that reduced her to her circumstances, the homeless girl, the charity case, the lucky find. She had lived inside that reduction before, and she knew what it did to you. But the reporter had not done that. She had written Mara the way Eugenia had first looked at her, as a person who was there, who had noticed something, who had done something with what she had noticed. The public responded to that version. Letters arrived at the library. Actual letters, handwritten, sent to the Aldene branch address, which had not received significant mail in years. They came from people who had been helped by libraries in dark moments. From people who had slept in libraries when they had nowhere else to go. From people who were angry that a building like this was under threat. From people who simply wanted to say they were paying attention. Eugenia read every one of them. She stored them in a box behind the circulation desk. The city's legal team filed their first formal challenge to the trust's validity 3 weeks after the story broke. They were careful and thorough, and their arguments were made well. Patricia Home had anticipated most of them and had responses prepared. But the process that began with that filing was slow and complicated and moved according to its own unhurried logic, and Mara could feel the library's funding timeline continuing underneath it like a current running in a direction she could not control. She began to understand something about power during this period. Not the dramatic, sudden kind, the kind that arrives like the storm in someone else's story, but the ordinary, structural kind, the kind that operates through process and patience and the ability to wait while others cannot. The city could wait. Municipal governments are built for patience. They have lawyers on salary and committees that meet quarterly and review processes that run for years. Individual people, libraries, homeless girls, old women in cardigans, these are not built for that kind of waiting. She thought about this at night, lying in the reading room, listening to the building settle around her. She had been thinking about the key. The iron key from the wooden box was not the key to the sealed room. The panel mechanism required the false book, not a physical key. She had gone back to Harwick's letter and read it 3 more times, looking for reference to the key, and found nothing explicit. But she thought about the way the letter was written, the way Harwick had thought in layers. A man who hides a room inside a wall does not leave a key without a lock. She began looking. It took her 10 days of working through the building in her spare hours, after closing, before opening, in the spaces between visitors and phone calls and consultations with Patricia Home. She went room by room. She looked at every door, every cabinet, every piece of furniture that had been there long enough to have been part of Harwick's original structure. The library had a basement. She had been down there once, early on, looking for a replacement bulb for the reading room. It was not a welcoming space, low-ceilinged, concrete, mostly occupied by old shelving units and cardboard boxes of materials that had accumulated over decades and been neither examined nor discarded. The kind of accumulation that happens in institutions when no one has the time or authority to address it properly. She went back to the basement. She went through it slowly this time, methodically, moving boxes and pulling out shelving units to see what was behind them. It was dusty and cold and not pleasant work. But she was the kind of person who did not stop a thing once she had started it, which had kept her alive through 11 days on the street and would, she suspected, keep her alive through whatever came next. Behind the second set of shelving units on the north wall, she found a door. Not concealed exactly. Not like the panel upstairs. Simply blocked. A door that had not been accessible because the shelving unit had been pushed in front of it and left there long enough that everyone had forgotten it existed. The door was wooden, old, with a lock that matched the iron key's specific shape. She stood in front of it for a moment. She was alone. She had not told Eugenia she was looking, because she had not wanted to raise a hope that might not be there. She stood in the cold basement with the iron key in her hand and the bare bulb casting shadows across the concrete, and she thought about Arthur Harwick, who had planned everything in layers. She put the key in the lock. It turned. The room beyond was small, smaller than the one upstairs. It had been built, she would later learn from Leonard Foss, in the original 1921 construction, before the 1947 edition that had changed the basement's layout and inadvertently placed the shelving unit in front of the door. It had not been accessed since at least the mid-1940s. It held three things. The first was a safe, a substantial one, old, with a dial that she could not open. The second was a leather satchel, old and stiff but intact, containing papers she could not yet read clearly in the basement light, but which appeared to be personal correspondence and business documents. The third was a painting. It was leaned against the back wall, wrapped in cloth that had dried and stiffened over decades. She peeled the cloth back carefully, one edge at a time, and revealed a canvas approximately 2 feet by 3 feet. The paint was dark with age and the varnish had yellowed, but the image was clear. Enough. A figure, seated, dark background, the particular quality of light that she associated with a specific period and tradition without being able to name it precisely. She stood in the basement and looked at it for a long time. Then she went upstairs and found Eugenia and told her what she had found. Leonard Foss came back the next morning. He went down to the basement and looked at the painting and did not say anything for a very long time. He used the loupe. He looked at the back of the canvas, at the stretcher bars, at the way the paint had been applied and cracked and settled over time. Then he straightened up and looked at Mara. "Do you know what this is?" he said. "No," she said. "I know it's old." "It is a portrait," he said. "The subject is unidentified, which is common for works of this period. The artist is not unidentified." He paused. "Or rather, I believe it is not unidentified. I believe I know whose work this is. And if I am right, this single painting is worth more than everything in the room upstairs." Mara stood very still. "How much more?" she said. Leonard Foss took off his glasses and looked at her. "In the current market," he said, "a work of this attribution and condition, authenticated correctly, would sell at auction for somewhere between $60 and $90 million. That is on its own. That is before the books. That is before the maps. That is before whatever is in that safe." Mara felt the basement floor very solidly beneath her feet. The concrete, the cold, the bare bulb, the iron shelving unit she had moved herself 2 days ago. She thought about how the world looked from inside a print shop awning in the rain, and she thought about how it looked from inside a sealed room in a basement where no one had been for 80 years, and she thought about how those two places existed in the same city, on the same morning, simultaneously, and how the distance between them was sometimes only a locked door and a key. She thought about the library upstairs, the cracked steps and the slipped D above the door, and the 32 patrons in October and Eugenia's 41 years, and the space heater behind the desk, and the cabinet with the blankets, and the chair on the fourth shelf that was driest in the building. She thought about what she was going to do next. She was going to fight, not because she had become powerful, not because she had found something that made her important. She was going to fight because the building deserved it, and Eugenia deserved it, and the 32 patrons in October, and the letters in the box behind the circulation desk, and every person who had ever found shelter in a library when there was nowhere else to go, they all deserved it. And because Arthur Harwick had believed, 100 years ago, that the right person would find this room at the right time, she intended to prove him right. The city's legal challenge moved through the courts with the deliberate pace of institutional machinery. Patricia Home filed responses. Expert witnesses were identified. The trust's history was traced through the municipal archives. Leonard Foss provided a formal preliminary assessment, carefully worded, that was entered as evidence. The painting was examined by a conservator Foss arranged, who confirmed under professional opinion the attribution he had suspected. The news coverage did not stop. It grew. It moved from local to national, and then from national to international, because the story contained something that traveled well across language and context. A girl with nothing. A library about to close. A sealed room. 100 years of waiting. The world has always had a particular appetite for the story of the overlooked thing that turns out to matter. More importantly, and more usefully, the public pressure built. City council members, who had been voting annually to continue the funding review without resolution, began receiving correspondence from constituents at volumes that required attention. 3 council members, separately and publicly, stated their opposition to any outcome that would result in the library's closure. A local foundation, moved by the story and by the specific legal vulnerability of the trust position, established an interim fund to cover the library's operating costs during the legal process, ensuring that whatever happened in the courts, the building would remain open. Eugenia received all of this with the same steady, unembellished attention she brought to everything. She continued to open the library at 9 and close it at 6. She continued to maintain the card catalog and fix the things that needed fixing and make tea and offer the driest chair to people who needed to sit down. When journalists came, she spoke to them plainly. When city officials came, she was polite and offered them tea. When people arrived simply because they had read the story and wanted to see the building, she let them in and showed them around and answered their questions with the patience of someone who had been telling the story of this place for 4 decades and had finally found an audience large enough to hear it. What changed for Eugenia in these months was not visible in any single moment. It was visible in the accumulation of moments, in the way she moved through the building slightly differently, with a quality that Mara gradually identified as ease. The specific ease of someone who has been carrying something alone for a very long time and has been given, at last, someone to carry it with them. Mara thought about this often, about what it means to carry something alone, about how the weight of a thing is different when it is shared, not halved exactly, but altered in nature, changed from a burden into something more like a purpose. She had been carrying her own weight alone for a very long time, since before the 11 days on the street, since the apartment on the east side had stopped being a home, since the things that fall apart quietly had begun falling apart. She had carried it because there was no other option and because she was the kind of person who does not set things down simply because they are heavy. But something had shifted in her since the sealed room. Not dramatically, not in the way that stories sometimes tell it, as a sudden transformation, a before and after with a clean line between them. More gradually, more genuinely, the way things actually change. She had begun to believe that she deserved to be somewhere. Not this specific somewhere. Not $300 million in a sealed room and a trust document with her name in it. Just somewhere. A place that was hers. A space to exist in without waiting to be removed from it. The safe in the basement took 3 weeks to open. A locksmith was required, then a conservator, then Patricia home to oversee the process and document everything properly for the legal case. When it finally opened, in the presence of Mara, Eugenia, Patricia, and Leonard Foss, it contained 2 more items that Leonard identified as significant: a small illuminated book of hours, French, 14th century, in extraordinary condition, and a bundle of correspondence between Harwick and several European dealers that documented the provenance of the most significant pieces in the collection upstairs. The provenance documentation was, Patricia explained, the most legally valuable thing in the safe. It answered, in advance, questions that the court would need answered about the collection's origins and legitimacy. Harwick had kept records as carefully as he had kept everything else. He had known someone would need them. He had known, 100 years ago, sitting in a city that did not fully understand what he had built, writing a letter to a person he would never meet, that someone would need these records. He had known that the thing he was leaving behind would be contested. He had known that the world does not simply accept gifts, particularly gifts of this size, without attempting to argue about them. He had prepared accordingly. Mara sat in the reading room the evening after the safe was opened, with Eugenia's blanket around her shoulders and a cup of tea growing cold on the table, and she thought about what it meant to plan for people you would never know. To believe, without evidence, in the existence of a future in which your work would matter. She thought about what kind of faith that required, not the religious kind necessarily, but the more ordinary and perhaps more difficult kind, the faith that the world would keep going, that buildings would stand, that people would come to them. She thought about the 32 patrons in October. She picked up her phone and called Patricia home. "Tell me honestly," she said. "Are we going to win?" Patricia was quiet for a moment. "I think we have an excellent case," she said. "I think the trust is valid and the executor provision is enforceable. I think the court will agree. But I also think it will take longer than we want and cost more than we want, and the city will not make it easy." But we'll win, Mara said. Another pause. Shorter this time. Yes, Patricia said. I believe we'll win. Mara set down the phone. Outside, through the grime-filmed windows of the reading room, the street was quiet. The evening light fell on the cracked steps, on the letters above the door where the D had slipped to one side, on the old limestone that held on to cold and gave it back slowly. She thought about a man who had built something and died and been forgotten. She thought about a woman who had kept the heat on for 41 years. She thought about herself, for weeks ago, knocking twice at the bottom of a stuck door in the rain. She thought about 55 items on a shelf behind glass, waiting for exactly this long for exactly this moment. She thought about what it means to be the right person at the right time. Not special, not chosen in any dramatic, fated sense. Just present, just paying attention, just the one who was there when the moment arrived, and who had the good sense, or the desperation, or the particular kind of stubbornness that looks like hope from the outside, to walk through the door that opened. She pulled the blanket a little tighter. Outside, someone was walking along Marlowe Street. A single figure, moving quickly in the cold. They passed the library without looking up. 33 patrons in November. The story was not finished. The legal process would continue for months. The city would not concede gracefully. There were arguments still to be made and documents still to be filed and days still to be endured when the outcome felt uncertain. There was still the question of what happened after, what the collection would do and how the trust would be administered, and what the library would become when it was no longer under threat. None of that was resolved yet. But in the reading room, with the space heater ticking quietly in the corner, and the tea cooling on the table, and the building settling around her in the old familiar way, Mara felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt like she was not going anywhere. That was enough for now. That was, in fact, everything. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday in February, for months after the story had first run in the paper, and Mara did not sleep the night before. She lay on the floor of the reading room, which had become so familiar to her by now that she could navigate it in complete darkness without touching anything, and she stared at the ceiling and listened to the building. She had learned to read its sounds the way a sailor reads weather. The tick of the pipes meant the heat was working. The particular low moan of the north-facing windows meant the wind was coming from the river. The slow creak of the third board from the top of the main staircase meant the temperature had dropped overnight. She knew all of it. She knew this building the way she had never known anywhere she had ever tried to call home, intimately, specifically, in the accumulated detail of daily presence. That was what frightened her most about tomorrow. Not the legal arguments, which Patricia Home had prepared with extraordinary thoroughness, and not the judge, who was reported to be careful and fair, and not the city's lawyers, whose position she and Patricia had discussed until they both understood it better than its authors. What frightened her was the thought of losing this building, of walking back out through the door that had opened to her in the rain and not being allowed to return, of the heat going off and Eugenia going home for the last time, and the sealed room being opened by people who saw only asset value and the letters in the box behind the desk being discarded because they were not relevant to the inventory. She thought about 32 patrons in October. She thought about what a library is. Not the building, exactly, though the building matters, the specific smell and the specific light and the specific quality of silence that a library has, which is different from every other kind of silence because it is not empty. It is inhabited silence, the silence of people thinking, the silence of words being absorbed, the silence of minds doing the work that minds need to do when the rest of the world is too loud. A library is that silence, available to anyone who walks through the door, available without condition, without requiring you to purchase something or explain yourself or perform any version of yourself other than the one that needs to sit quietly and think. She had needed that silence badly enough to knock on a stuck door in the rain. She thought about how many other people needed it and did not know where to find it. Eventually the pipes ticked and the wind moved and the third board creaked and the darkness outside the grimy windows began to lighten, and she got up and made tea and waited for Eugenia. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Eugenia arrived at 8:30, which was 30 minutes earlier than usual. She was wearing her good coat, the one that was not the cardigan, dark wool, well kept, the kind of coat that had been purchased decades ago with the intention of lasting and had fulfilled that intention completely. She had her hair pinned back as always. She carried her usual bag. She looked, Mara thought, exactly like herself. Not dressed up for the occasion. Not performing solemnity or importance. Just herself, on a Tuesday in February, coming to a building she had been coming to for 41 years. She sat down across from Mara and looked at the tea and then looked at Mara. "Did you sleep?" she asked. "Some," Mara said. Eugenia nodded, accepting this without comment. She poured her tea. She looked at the wall for a moment in the way she looked at things she was thinking carefully about. "Whatever happens today," she said, "I want you to understand something." Mara waited. "You found what I could not find," Eugenia said. "In 41 years, I knew something was there. I felt it the way you feel a draft before you find a crack. I looked, periodically, without the right help, without the right angle of approach. And I did not find it." She paused. "You were here 4 weeks. You found it in 4 weeks." "I had more time," Mara said. "I was here all the time. I had nowhere else to be." "Yes," Eugenia said. "And isn't that interesting?" Mara looked at her. "The building gave you nowhere else to be," Eugenia said. "And you gave the building what it needed. That is not an accident. That is not luck. That is something working the way it was meant to work." She picked up her cup. Arthur Harwick understood that. He wrote it in his letter. He said the right person would come when the time was right. He did not say it would be a person of means or credentials or particular status. He said it would be the right person. She looked at Mara steadily. "I believe you are the right person. I believed it from the morning you knocked twice at the bottom of the door." Mara looked at the table. She had spent months being afraid that she was not enough for what had been found, that the trust's executor provision would be challenged not only by the city, but by her own insufficiency, that a court or a lawyer or a common-sense argument would locate the obvious gap between what the situation required and what she actually was. A 19-year-old with no address and no history. She had waited for that argument to be made against her. It had not been made. Or rather, it had been implied, in certain early news coverage, in certain city officials' public statements, in the careful way some people phrased their surprise that she specifically had been the one to find the room. She had heard it underneath the surface of polite sentences. But no one had made the argument directly, perhaps because making it directly would have required saying something that no one wanted to say plainly about who deserves to find things. She had not deflected that implication. She had simply continued. "Thank you," she said to Eugenia. Eugenia set down her cup. "Don't thank me. Go win." The courthouse was a 20-minute walk from the library. Mara and Patricia home walked together in the cold, Patricia carrying a briefcase of organized methodical weight, Mara carrying nothing except her phone and the folded copy of the trust document she had been carrying in her coat pocket for months. She had read it so many times she had portions of it memorized. She found the specific density of the legal language, which had at first been impenetrable, oddly comforting now. It was precise. It meant exactly what it said. The ambiguity in it was not in the words, but in how a court would choose to read them, and that was what today was for. The courtroom was not large. There were seats for perhaps 60 people, and by the time the hearing began most of them were filled, journalists and interested parties, and several people Mara recognized from the library's new and growing community of supporters, people who had started coming in after the story broke, faces she had learned over the months of keeping the building open and continuing the ordinary work of a library while the extraordinary work of the legal case ran alongside it. Leonard Foss was there, in his decades-worn coat, the loop on its cord around his neck, as always. The lawyer who had called from another city, the trust specialist, was there, having agreed to appear as a supporting voice on the validity question. 2 professors from the university's history department were there, having submitted written statements about the significance of the collection. And at the back of the room, Mara noticed, was a man she had seen once before, briefly, in the early weeks of the coverage. A city council member who had publicly stated his opposition to the library's closure. He was sitting alone, without aides or staff, in an ordinary seat, watching. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Harriet Voss, with close-cropped gray hair and reading glasses on a chain, and the particular manner of a person who has been listening carefully to arguments for decades and has developed a refined sensitivity to which ones are genuine and which ones are performances. She moved through the procedural opening with efficient speed, and then looked at the city's lawyer with the expression of someone ready to hear what they had to say and prepared to find it insufficient. The city's argument took 90 minutes. Mara listened to all of it without allowing her expression to change, which required effort. The argument was skillfully made. She could acknowledge that, built on a series of reasonable-sounding propositions about municipal governance and the limits of pre-existing private trust instruments and the public interest in significant cultural assets. It cited case law. It used language about stewardship and public accountability that would have been compelling if you did not know that the city's actual stewardship of the library had consisted largely of a 14-month funding review aimed at closing it. Patricia Holmes' response took 2 hours. She was not dramatic. She was not emotional. She was precise, and she was thorough, and she moved through the city's arguments one by one with the calm, methodical attention of someone dismantling a structure that has been built incorrectly, identifying each weak joint and demonstrating clearly why it would not hold. She walked the court through the trust instrument's history, the original transfer terms, the documentation of continuity through successive municipal administrations. She cited the provenance records from the basement safe, which established the collection's history and Harwick's intent beyond reasonable question. She addressed the executor provision directly, citing the legal precedents for personal executor designations in charitable trusts and demonstrating that the circumstances of this particular designation, unusual as they were, satisfied the standard requirements for validity. And then she called Mara to speak. This had not been in the original plan. Patricia had added it 2 weeks before the hearing, after a conversation in which she had looked at Mara for a long moment and said, very simply, that the judge needed to understand who the executor was. Not the credentials, not the history, not the legal argument. The person. Mara stood at the front of the courtroom and looked at Judge Voss and said what was true. She said she had been sleeping outside for 11 days when she found the library. She said she had been given a blanket and a cup of tea and the space to exist without being required to justify her existence, and that this was not a small thing, and she did not want the court to treat it as a small thing. She said she had spent 4 weeks in the building before she found the hidden room, and that she had found it because she had been looking, and she had been looking because the building had seemed to her, from the first morning, like a place that held more than what was visible, and she had been raised by circumstances to notice the things that other people looked past. She said she understood that she was 19 years old and had no credentials and no fixed address and no history that any institution would find immediately reassuring. She said she understood that the trust's executor provision was unusual. She said she had read Arthur Harwick's letter many times, and that what it said, plainly and without ambiguity, was that the person who found the room was the right person for the room, and that she believed this not because it was convenient for her to believe it, but because she had read how he thought, through his letter and through the evidence of what he had built, and she believed he had meant it precisely. She said the library had been open to her when nothing else was. She said she intended to make sure it was open to everyone who came to it in the same condition she had arrived in. She said she did not believe Arthur Harwick had sealed a room full of irreplaceable things for 100 years so that the city could use them to build a parking structure or a development project or any other thing that would put a wall between this corner of Marlowe Street and the people who needed what a library provides. She said she intended to win. She sat down. The courtroom was quiet for a moment. Judge Voss looked at her notepad. She looked at the city's lawyer. She looked at Patricia Holmes. She looked at Mara. Then she said she would have a ruling by the end of the week. The 4 days between the hearing and the ruling were the longest of Mara's life, and her life had contained some long stretches of time. She kept the library's ordinary rhythm, opening at 9, closing at 6, maintaining the catalog and fixing what needed fixing and making tea and being present for the patrons who came in increasing numbers now, some drawn by curiosity and some by genuine need and some by both. She had begun a quiet, informal program over the previous months, nothing official, nothing that required a grant or a committee. Simply being available, sitting at the table near the window, and being the kind of person who could be approached, who would listen, who would help locate the right book or the right resource or the right form for whatever someone needed to navigate. She had not planned to do this. It had simply become what she did in the hours when she was not needed elsewhere, because she understood the specific experience of needing something and not knowing how to find it, and she had discovered that she was good at the navigation. She thought about what the library could become, not instead of what it was, not as a replacement for the specific, irreplaceable thing Eugenia had maintained through 4 decades of threat and understaffing and institutional indifference. As an extension of it, a deepening. The sealed room opened and its resources directed not toward extraction, but toward continuation, toward the building of something that would outlast this particular crisis and the next one and the one after that. She thought about endowments. She had been reading about them, carefully, with the same attention she had brought to the trust documents and the rare book histories and the legal arguments. She understood that a properly structured endowment could do what Harwick had tried to do with his sealed room, make the library's existence independent of the city's willingness to fund it, remove it from the cycle of review and threat that had been its condition for as long as anyone could remember. She thought about programs, about the people who came in now and the people who had come before the story broke, and the people who would come after, the ones with the specific look she recognized because she had worn it, the look of someone who needed to be somewhere warm and quiet and was not sure they were allowed to be there. She thought about making sure they knew they were allowed. She thought about the letters in the box behind the circulation desk, which now numbered in the hundreds and came from places far beyond the city. She thought about Arthur Harwick, who had written his letter to a future he could not see and had trusted the future to produce the right person to receive it. She thought she understood him better than she had at the beginning, not as a figure from history, distant and abstract, as a person who had understood something about what endures. Not money, not influence, not buildings even, though buildings help. What endures is the decision to make something available to people you will never meet. The act of opening your hand and letting go. On Friday morning, Patricia Home called at 9:15. Mara was behind the circulation desk. She picked up the phone and listened. She listened for 40 seconds without speaking. Then she said, "Thank you," and set the phone down. Eugenia was watching her from across the room. The same careful attention she had applied to everything from the beginning. Not reaching, not pushing, simply present and observant and ready for whatever the moment required. Mara looked at her. "We won," she said. The ruling was 22 pages long, and Mara read all of it that afternoon, sitting at the table near the window while the February light came through the grime-filmed glass and painted pale shapes on the floor. Judge Voss had found in favor of the trust on every significant point. The trust instrument was valid. The continuity of its conditions through successive municipal administrations had been established by the documentation. The executor provision was enforceable, unusual in form but unambiguous in intent. The collection remained the property of the Aldene Branch Library, to be administered by its trust executor in accordance with Harwick's stated terms. The city had the right to appeal. Patricia Home expected them to file. But the ruling's language was careful and thorough, built on reasoning that would be difficult to overturn, and the public climate around any appeal would be, to put it plainly, hostile. A city government appealing a ruling that kept a homeless girl in control of a library's historic collection was not a story that played well in any version of its telling. 3 days later, the city announced it would not appeal. The announcement came in a press release that was carefully worded and said very little beyond the basic fact. But the council member who had been sitting at the back of the courtroom called Patricia Home privately that afternoon and told her what the announcement did not say, that the internal political calculation had shifted, that the public response to the story had made the library's closure politically untenable regardless of the legal question, and that there were people within the city government who were now very interested in what the trust could do for the neighborhood if managed well. Mara received this information with the specific, tempered feeling of someone who has been fighting for long enough to be suspicious of easy victories. She called Patricia. "Is it over?" she said. "The legal challenge is over," Patricia said. "What comes next is different." "What comes next? Now you have to actually do it," Patricia said. "Run the trust. Manage the collection. Make decisions about the library's future. That's the harder part." Mara looked around the reading room. The old armchairs in varying states of deterioration. The fireplace that had not been used in decades. The shelves on 3 walls. The paneled wall that was no longer sealed. "I know," she said. "I've been thinking about it." She had been thinking about it for months. The first decision she made as trust executor was to commission a full professional appraisal of the collection. Not Leonard Foss alone, though he was part of it, but a team of specialists assembled with his guidance, experts in medieval manuscripts, in early printed books, in cartography, in oil painting of the relevant periods. They came in February and March and worked through the collection with the careful, unhurried attention it deserved, and their findings, when they were compiled into a formal report, confirmed and in some cases exceeded Leonard's preliminary estimates. The manuscript on the third shelf from the top of the left case was authenticated as one of 6 known copies of a 14th-century theological text. The most recent comparable sale had been in Geneva 11 years earlier. The appraiser's figure for this item alone was $43 million. The early printed book was what Leonard had believed it to be. There were 2 other known copies, both in institutional collections, neither of which had come to market in living memory. The appraised value, with all appropriate caveats, was $61 million. The maps were individually appraised. 3 of the 17 were of the extraordinary variety Leonard had predicted. The remaining 14 were of the genuinely significant variety. The total appraised value for the cartography collection was $38 million. The painting in the basement, which had been transported under controlled conditions to a conservation lab and examined over 6 weeks with every instrument and technique available to contemporary scholarship, was authenticated as the work of the artist Leonard had believed it to be, a Flemish master of the early 17th century, working in a style and period of extraordinary current market value. The authenticated appraisal figure was $81 million. The remaining items in the collection, the 37 ordinary and the 22 genuinely rare, the illuminated Book of Hours from the safe, and 12 additional items the appraisers identified as significant that the original inventory had undervalued, were assessed at a combined total of $64 million. The formal total appraised value of the Aldene collection, as it was now being called in the appraisal report and in the growing body of scholarly and press coverage, was $312 million. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Mara sat with the report for 2 days before she made any further decisions. She did not celebrate. She did not tell people the number, though it became public quickly because the appraisal report was a matter of legal record. She read the report carefully, all of it, and then she read Harwick's letter again, and then she sat for a long time with both of them in her hands and thought about what he had actually wanted. He had wanted the library to endure. He had wanted the collection to serve that purpose, to be available for use in the library's continuation if continuation was threatened. He had not said it should be liquidated entirely. He had not said it should be sold or scattered or used to do anything other than secure the library's future. She thought about what securing the future actually required. She thought about endowments, and what an endowment built on even a portion of this collection's value would generate annually, and what that annual figure would mean for a library that had been operating on a budget so thin it could not afford to replace burned-out bulbs. She thought about the difference between financial independence and the kind of dependency that a city's annual funding decision creates, where the fate of 32 patrons in October could be determined by a committee meeting she was not invited to attend. She began to build a plan. It took 3 months and required help from people she had not known at the beginning of any of this. A financial advisor who specialized in charitable foundations. A building architect who looked at the limestone structure on Marlow and Aldene with the careful eyes of someone who understood both what it had been and what it could become. Leonard Foss, who had by now become something close to a permanent fixture in the Harwick Room, working with a rotating team of scholars to catalog and document the collection properly for the first time. Patricia Home, who was now managing a trust administration that had grown considerably beyond the small practice 3 blocks away, but who had not handed it off to anyone else. And Eugenia. Eugenia was not a financial advisor or a lawyer or an architect. What she was, Mara had come to understand, was the memory of the building. She knew things about the library that were in no document that existed, only in the accumulated experience of 41 years of daily presence. She knew which walls were original and which were 1947 and which were 1968. She knew where the water came from when it rained hard from the east. She knew which patrons had been coming for 30 years and which had started last month and what each of them needed and how they liked to be spoken to. She knew the library the way Mara was learning to know it, from the inside, in the specific detail of daily life. Mara made her the library's director. This was not a complicated decision. It was, in fact, the easiest decision she made in the entire process, because it was simply a matter of making official what had always been true. Eugenia had been running this library on institutional memory and stubbornness for 4 decades. The title and the salary that now accompanied it were recognition, not appointment. Eugenia accepted without making a fuss. She said it was about time and went back to work. The plan that emerged from 3 months of building was this. A portion of the collection, specifically 22 of the genuinely rare items and 15 of the 37 ordinary items, would be sold at auction in carefully staged sales designed to maximize value without flooding the market. The projected proceeds from these sales, based on conservative appraisal estimates and current market conditions, were between $80 and $100 million. These proceeds would establish the Harwick Library Endowment, a permanent charitable foundation whose annual distributions would fund the Aldene branch library's operations in perpetuity, independent of city funding. The endowment would be large enough to fund not only the library's current operations, but a significant expansion of its programs and physical infrastructure. The remaining collection, the most significant items and those with the greatest scholarly value, would remain in the library. The sealed room would be renovated into a proper rare books reading room, climate-controlled and properly equipped, available to scholars by appointment and to the public for special exhibitions. The basement room would be restored and incorporated into the building's programming as an educational space. The building itself would be renovated, not reconstructed, not reimagined, not branded or repositioned. Renovated. The cracked steps repaired. The grime cleaned from the windows. The burned-out bulbs replaced. The old armchairs in the reading room re-upholstered. The fireplace restored to working order. The D above the door straightened. Not changed. Made more itself. The city, when presented with this plan, said very little publicly and a great deal privately. The council member who had been at the back of the courtroom became an informal ally in the administrative negotiations that followed, helping to navigate the relationship between the newly independent library endowment and the city structures that still technically administered the building's public functions. It was not always smooth. There were meetings that ran too long and disagreements that required patience and a particular kind of diplomatic firmness that Mara was still learning. But she was learning it. The auction was held in May at the city's largest auction house, which had requested the right to host it with a competitive urgency that had made Patricia Holmes' expression do something that might, in a different face, have been called delight. The sale was covered by arts press internationally. Scholars and collectors attended in person and by remote bid. The 22 rare items and 15 ordinary items that had been selected for sale went over 3 days, and the results were, in the careful language of the auction house's press release, above estimate. The total was $107 million. Mara was not at the auction. She was at the library, where Eugenia had organized an informal gathering of patrons and community members to watch a live stream of the proceedings on a laptop propped on the circulation desk. She sat in the back, in the driest chair on the 4th shelf, with her hands folded in her lap and her face doing the thing it did when she was processing something too large for immediate expression. When the final hammer fell and the total appeared on the screen, the room made a sound she had not been expecting. Not cheering, exactly. Something more complicated. The sound of people absorbing a fact that changed something they had been afraid of losing. She looked at Eugenia, who was standing at the circulation desk with her arms at her sides, and her expression doing the thing it did when something had been confirmed that she had believed for a very long time, without being able to prove. Their eyes met. Eugenia nodded once. Mara nodded back. The renovation took 8 months. Mara stayed through all of it, in the reading room at night, while the work happened around her during the days, learning the building in a new way, understanding its structure from the inside as the workers moved through it. The rare books room took the longest, because the specifications were exacting, because the items that would be housed there required conditions that left no room for error. The basement space was simpler but required its own care, stripping back decades of accumulated indifference to find the original structure beneath. The steps were repaired. The windows were cleaned, and for the first time in years, in decades, the light came through them clearly, and the rooms inside the building were filled with a quality of light that changed everything about them. that revealed the proportions and the details of the original construction in a way that the grime-dimmed amber of the previous years had not. The D above the door was straightened. Mara stood on the sidewalk on the morning after it was straightened and looked up at the building. The limestone pale in the winter light. The letters above the door legible now, complete. The steps solid beneath her. The windows clear. She thought about the first morning she had stood on these steps. The rain. The broken zipper. The 41 cents. She thought about the weight of the door and the smell that had come from inside when it opened and the quality of warmth she had felt, which was not just temperature, but something underneath temperature, something that had not been available to her in 11 days on the street. She thought about all the people who needed that and did not know it was here. The reopening was in March, 1 year and 4 months after she had first knocked twice at the bottom of the door in the rain. It was not a grand event. Eugenia had been firm about this, and Mara had agreed without argument. No ribbon cutting, no speeches from officials, no branded moment designed to be photographed. The library would open the way it always opened, at 9 in the morning, with the door unlocked and the heat on and tea available in the back office for anyone who needed it. What happened, because word had traveled in the way that things travel in a city when they matter to people, was that by 9:15 there was a line on the steps. Not the kind of line that forms for spectacle. The kind that forms because people have been waiting for something and have been told it is finally available. Families with children, students, older people who had been coming to this building for 30 years and had watched it diminish and had kept coming anyway. Younger people who had heard the story and come to see what a library could be. People Mara recognized from the months of the legal battle, who had sent letters and attended the hearing and kept showing up. And at the back of the line, hanging slightly apart, someone who looked the way Mara had looked 14 months earlier. Young, alone. The specific posture of someone who has learned to take up less space than they need, who is not sure of their welcome. A girl, perhaps 17, with a bag over her shoulder and shoes that had been wet and dried too many times. Mara watched her from inside the building as the line moved forward and the patrons came in, one by one, and found seats and made themselves at home in the renovated rooms that were the same rooms they had always been, and also, unmistakably, something more. When the girl reached the door, she paused, looking at the letters above the entrance, looking at the steps, looking uncertain, in the specific way of someone who knows they need something but is not sure they will be allowed to have it. Mara opened the door. "Come in," she said. "The chair on the 4th shelf is the driest one. There's tea in the back if you want it." The girl looked at her. "I'm not really she started. "You don't have to be anything," Mara said. "Come in." The girl came in. She went to the 4th shelf and found the chair and sat down and pulled her bag onto her lap and looked around the room with the expression that Mara recognized because she had worn it herself, the slow, cautious absorption of a space that was warm and quiet and not requiring anything of her. Mara went back to the circulation desk. She sat down and looked at the room, at the patrons finding their places, at Eugenia moving through the stacks with the unhurried efficiency of someone entirely at home, at the light coming through the clean windows and falling on the repaired floors and the reupholstered chairs and the shelves that held both the ordinary books and the extraordinary ones, the things that had been donated over decades and the things that had been sealed for a century and were now available to anyone who wanted them. She thought about Arthur Harwick, who had died in 1931 and had not seen any of this, who had sat in a room and written a letter to a future he could not see and had trusted the future to produce what it needed. She thought about Eugenia, who had kept the heat on for 41 years. She thought about the girl in the driest chair on the 4th shelf, who had come in out of the cold. She thought about what it means to leave something behind for people you will never meet, to open your hand and let go, to believe, without evidence, in the existence of a future in which your work will matter. She thought she understood it now, not as an idea, as a fact she inhabited. There are things that endure because they are built to endure, with limestone and iron and careful joinery, with trust documents and provenance records and legal instruments that survive decades of administrative reshuffling. And there are things that endure because people decide they will, because someone in a cardigan keeps the heat on, because someone with a broken zipper knocks twice at the bottom of a stuck door and something inside responds. Both kinds of endurance matter. They reinforce each other. They are, in the end, the same thing expressed in different materials. She picked up the library card she had found on the sidewalk 3 weeks before she first came to this building. She had carried it in her coat pocket through everything, through the 11 days on the street, and the 4 weeks of quiet arrangement, and the months of legal battle, and the appraisal, and the auction, and the renovation, and this morning. It was worn at the edges and slightly soft with handling, and bore the name of someone she had never met. She set it on the desk. Then she took a new card from the tray beside the keyboard and wrote her own name on it. Mara Ellison. The address of the library. The date. She set it next to the old one. Outside, on Marlow and Aldene, the city moved through its Tuesday morning. Buses and pedestrians and delivery trucks and the ordinary enormous machinery of a city in motion, indifferent and unstoppable. The building stood at the corner the way it had stood since 1921, pale limestone, solid, the letters above the door straight and legible in the winter light. The door was open. The heat was on. The chair on the fourth shelf was occupied. And somewhere beneath the building, in a renovated room with climate control and proper lighting and a small bronze plaque that read Harwick Collection, 119 items that had been waiting for 100 years sat in their cases behind glass, available now, accessible now, part of the world that had taken so long to find them. Not locked away, not extracted, just here, for whoever comes through the door when the time is right. The city did not change overnight. That was something Mara had to learn, the way you learn things that do not come naturally, through repetition and disappointment and the slow accumulation of evidence. She had believed, in the first flush of the court ruling and the auction proceeds and the renovation plans, that the hardest part was finished, that the building was safe now, that the endowment would hold, that the work ahead was simply the good work of making something flourish rather than the grinding work of keeping something alive. She was not entirely wrong, but she was not entirely right, either. The library opened its renovated doors in March, and by April the daily count had climbed from 32 to over 200. By May it was higher. People came because the story had made them curious, and they stayed because the place was what it had always been, warm and quiet and available without condition, and now also clean and well-lit, and staffed by Eugenia and 2 part-time assistants the endowment had made it possible to hire, and stocked with new acquisitions that Mara had begun selecting with the care of someone who understood what it meant to need a specific book and not be able to find it. She ordered books in Spanish and Tagalog and Mandarin and Arabic, because the neighborhood had changed in the decades since Harwick had built the collection, and what the neighborhood needed had changed with it. She ordered books at every reading level, from picture books to technical manuals, because she understood that the measure of a library was not the sophistication of its collection but the breadth of it, the degree to which it covered the full range of what human beings needed to know. She ordered books about tenant rights and immigration law and small business registration and public benefits programs, because she had learned, in the months of being available at the table near the window, that what people often most urgently needed was not literature or history or the particular pleasures of reading for its own sake, but information. Practical, specific, navigable information about the systems that govern their lives and the options available to them within those systems. She thought a great deal, during this period, about what a library actually is. Not in the abstract sense, not as a civic institution or a cultural symbol, but in the daily, particular sense of what it does and who it serves and how. She thought about the specific experience of needing to know something and having nowhere to look. She had lived that experience in concrete ways, on the street, in the months before the library, when she had needed to understand things about housing law and social services and the specific bureaucratic geography of systems that were not designed to be navigable by the people who most needed to navigate them. She thought about the gap between the information that existed and the information that was accessible, and she thought about how much of her own life had been spent on the wrong side of that gap. The library could not close that gap entirely, but it could make it smaller. She hired a legal aid coordinator, a recently retired paralegal named Sonia, who had spent 30 years in family court and knew more about the practical reality of the city's systems than any lawyer Mara had met. Sonia sat up at a table in the corner of the front room 3 days a week and was immediately and consistently occupied. The line to speak with her sometimes stretched to the door. Mara watched this and thought about all the years the table had sat empty, all the people who had needed what Sonia provided and had not known where to find it, and she felt the specific, quiet anger of someone who understands that a problem did not have to persist as long as it did. She established a homework help program that ran 4 afternoons a week, staffed by volunteers from the university that Leonard Foss connected her with, graduate students in education and social work who needed supervised hours, and brought to the work an attention and energy that Mara found moving every time she witnessed it. Children who had been doing their homework on the floor of apartments with no quiet corner and no one to ask for help were now doing it at a table in a building that was theirs, that had been built for them, even if the man who built it had been dead for nearly a century. She thought about Harwick often, not with the reverence that had colored her early relationship to his memory, the gratitude tinged with awe of someone who has been given something large and unexpected. She thought about him more simply now, more personally, as someone who had understood something she was still in the process of understanding, that the most durable things you can build are not the ones that stand unchanged through time, but the ones that change in exactly the ways they need to in order to remain useful, that a building is not preserved by keeping it static, but by keeping it necessary. The Harwick collection was formally opened to scholars in September. The Rare Books reading room, climate-controlled and properly lit, with the viewing stands and archival gloves, and the security protocols that the collection's value demanded, became within months one of the most visited small rare books facilities in the region. Researchers came from universities across the country and from abroad, drawn by the specific items in the collection that had no equivalent elsewhere and by the extraordinary circumstances of its discovery. Leonard Foss spent 3 days a week in the room, working on what had become his final scholarly project, a comprehensive study of Harwick as a collector, drawing on the personal correspondence from the basement satchel and the provenance records from the safe, and his own decades of expertise to reconstruct the story of how the collection had been assembled. He worked with the focused, unhurried pleasure of someone doing the thing they were born to do, and the manuscript he was producing, Mara had seen enough of it to know, was going to matter. She had read the correspondence from the basement satchel herself, carefully, over several evenings in the reading room. The letters covered 20 years of Harwick's collecting life, and they painted a picture more complex than the letter in the wooden box had suggested. He was not simply a generous eccentric who had left his books to the neighborhood out of civic virtue. He was a man who had been lonely, and who had found in the acquisition and preservation of beautiful things a substitute for the human connections that had not come easily to him, and who had understood, late in his life, that the substitute was insufficient. He had written, in a letter to a dealer in Paris dated 1927, something that she had copied into her notebook because it had seemed too important to trust to memory alone. He had written that he had spent 30 years acquiring things, and that the things were extraordinary, and that he was certain no one else would have assembled precisely this collection, and that none of this meant anything at all if no one ever saw them. He had written that he had decided to give everything to the library because the library was the only place in the city where a person could walk in without money and without status and without any particular claim on anyone's attention and be given access to the best that had been thought and known. He had written that this seemed to him the most important thing a building could do. She thought about that sentence for a long time. The most important thing a building could do. She thought about the girl in the driest chair on the 4th shelf, who had come in out of the cold on the morning of the reopening. Her name, Mara had learned over the following weeks, was Danny. She was 17. She had been staying with a series of friends and family members whose willingness to shelter her had run out in sequence, the specific pattern of diminishing options that Mara recognized from her own experience. She came to the library every morning and stayed until closing and was, Mara observed, reading with the intensity of someone making up for lost time. Mara did not approach her for the first 2 weeks. She had learned from Eugenia the particular value of the unhurried approach, the discipline of being available without being intrusive, of making a space that someone could enter when they were ready rather than when they were pushed. She simply made sure that Danny knew the tea was available and that Sonia was at her corner table 3 days a week, and that the books on tenant rights and emergency housing were on the shelf where they could be found by someone who was looking without wanting to ask. On the 3rd week, Danny came to the circulation desk. She did not say anything for a moment. She looked at Mara with the expression of someone who has decided to trust something and is not yet certain the decision is right. "I read about you," she said finally. "How you found it?" "The room." "Yes," Mara said. "Were you scared?" Mara thought about it honestly. Not of the room, she said. Of what came after. Danny nodded slowly. She understood that distinction. You could tell from her face. It was the face of someone who had been frightened not of the dark thing itself, but of the moment after the dark thing ended, when you had to figure out what kind of person you were going to be now that the crisis had passed. What came after was better, Mara said. Not easier. Better. Danny nodded again. Then she went back to her chair. But she came back to the desk the following day, and the day after that, and over the weeks and months that followed, she became a fixture in the building in the way that Mara had become a fixture, through daily presence and specific usefulness, through noticing what needed doing and doing it without being asked. She had a talent for the catalog, a patience with the organizational logic of how information was structured and retrieved that Mara recognized as the particular intelligence of someone who had learned to find their way through systems that were not designed for them. She could look at a shelf that was slightly wrong and understand immediately what would make it right. She remembered where things were. She remembered what patrons had asked for and what they had come back for and what they had needed that the library did not yet have. Eugenia noticed it too. By January, she had offered Danny a part-time paid position, the third of the three the endowment had made possible. Danny had accepted with the careful, slightly stunned expression of someone receiving something they had wanted badly and had not allowed themselves to expect. Mara watched this and felt something she did not immediately have a name for. Something adjacent to the feeling she had had on the morning of the reopening, when she had held the door open and said, "Come in." Not pride exactly. Something quieter and more durable. The feeling of a thing working the way it was meant to work. The feeling of a circle completing itself not with drama, but with the ordinary, unhurried motion of continuity. The endowment grew through the second year at a rate that surprised even the financial advisor. The investments were conservative, deliberately so, because Mara's priority was stability over return, the elimination of the specific vulnerability that had governed the library's existence for decades, the dependence on annual decisions made by people with other priorities. The endowment was designed to be boring in exactly the right ways, to generate a reliable, predictable income that the library's operations could be built around without the constant awareness of possible collapse. She had learned the language of endowments and charitable foundations and trust administration with the same focused attention she had brought to the trust document and the legal arguments and the appraisal reports. It was not the language she would have chosen to learn, but it was the language the work required, and she was the kind of person who learned what the work required. She had always been that kind of person, even before, back in the apartment on the east side, when the things that were required of her were survival and self-sufficiency and the management of circumstances that should not have been hers to manage. She had also, quietly, and without making it a larger thing than it was, obtained her GED in the early months of the legal battle, studying in the evenings in the reading room after the building closed. She had done it not because she felt the credential was necessary, but because she was tired of carrying the gap as a thing to be ashamed of, and because completing it felt like closing a door that had been left open behind her for 3 years, letting in a draft of unfinished business she was ready to be done with. She had not announced it. She had told Eugenia, who had said good and gone back to what she was doing, which was the correct response and exactly what Mara had needed. Not ceremony, not celebration, just acknowledgement and the return to ordinary work, which was its own kind of celebration, the celebration of someone who understands that the credential is not the thing. The thing is what you do with the days you are given. She was thinking, by the second autumn, about what came next. The question of what came next had not left her since the morning of the ruling, when Patricia Home had said now you have to actually do it, and she had understood that the legal victory was a beginning rather than an ending. She had spent 2 years doing it, building and managing and making decisions and learning the language of each new domain the work required. She was 19 when she found the room and 21 now, and the person she was at 21 was not the same person as the one who had knocked twice at the bottom of a stuck door in the rain, though they were connected in ways she was still mapping, still discovering the full shape of. She was thinking about other libraries. Not abstractly. Specifically, there were 14 branch libraries in the city, and the Aldene branch was not the only one under threat. The funding structures that had nearly closed Aldene were the same structures that governed the others, the same cycle of review and shortfall and reduced hours, and the slow erosion of capacity that preceded closure. She had been to 3 of them since the ruling, quietly, without announcing herself, and what she had found was what she had expected. The same quality of maintained endurance in the people who worked there, the same signs of someone doing more than their resources justified, the same populations of patrons who needed more than what could currently be offered, the same stubborn, patient faithfulness of people who had decided that the building was worth showing up for, regardless of what the institution did or did not provide. She thought about what Harwick had understood, that the most important thing a building can do is be available to the person who walks in without money and without status and without any particular claim on anyone's attention. She thought about 14 buildings. She thought about what it would take to give all of them the stability that the endowment had given Aldene. Not the same solution, because the circumstances were different, and because solutions that are simply replicated without attention to context tend to produce results that resemble the original without capturing what made it work. But the same principle: stability, independence from the annual decisions of people with other priorities. The removal of the specific vulnerability that made libraries like these permanently precarious, permanently aware that their continuation depended on decisions they had no part in making. She had begun conversations, careful and preliminary, with 3 people. The trust specialist who had appeared at the hearing and who had spent the intervening 2 years becoming a more consistent presence in her professional life. A man named David who had the rare quality of understanding both the legal structures and the human purposes they were meant to serve. A foundation director she had met at a conference on urban libraries. A woman named Ruth who had spent 20 years building philanthropic structures in cities where private wealth had been persuaded to serve public purposes, and who spoke about this work with the particular authority of someone who had been told it was impossible and had done it anyway. And the city council member who had been sitting at the back of the courtroom on the day of the ruling and who had, in the time since, proved to be exactly what his presence in that room had suggested, a person who understood which direction things were moving and was prepared to move with them before he was required to. These conversations were slow. They would be slow for a long time. She understood that now, the specific patience required by work that operates on the timescale of institutions rather than the timescale of individual lives. She had learned it from Eugenia, who had maintained faith in a building for 41 years without visible evidence that the faith was justified. She had learned it from Harwick, who had sealed a room and written a letter to someone he would never meet, trusting the future to deliver the letter to the right address. She had learned it from the legal process, which had moved at its own unhurried pace regardless of her urgency, and which had arrived at the right place regardless of how slow the arrival had been. She was learning, gradually, and with some difficulty, to trust that pace, to understand that the work she was doing now, the slow conversations and the careful relationship building and the unglamorous administration of a charitable trust, was not waiting for the real work to begin. It was the real work, the foundation work, the kind that determines whether everything built on top of it will stand. She thought about the cracks in the steps. She thought about how long they had been there before anyone had the resources to repair them. On a Tuesday in November, 2 years after she had first pushed open the door on Marlowe Street, she was sitting at the circulation desk when a man came in who she did not recognize. He was perhaps 60, well-dressed in a quiet way, carrying a briefcase and the expression of someone who had looked up an address and verified it twice before coming. He stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at the room with the expression of someone forming their own opinion of a place they had heard about. He approached the desk. "I'm looking for Mara Ellison," he said. "That's me," she said. He looked at her for a moment with the specific recalibrating expression she had seen many times in 2 years, the adjustment that happened when people who had formed an image of her from the coverage met her in person and found someone younger and quieter and less dramatic than the story had led them to expect. She had stopped finding this adjustment interesting. It had become simply a feature of conversations with people who had read about her before they met her. He introduced himself. He was a lawyer from a firm in the city, representing the estate of a woman named Helen Marsh, recently deceased, who had been a patron of the Aldene Branch Library for 60 years. Helen Marsh had left, in her will, a bequest to the Harwick Library endowment. The bequest was not large by the standards of what the endowment already held. It was $140,000, which represented, the lawyer explained, the majority of Helen Marsh's liquid assets. He placed a letter on the desk. It was handwritten, on pale blue paper, addressed to the endowment in a hand that was careful and slightly trembling. He said she had written it herself several months before her death and left it with the will specifically to accompany the bequest. He excused himself and sat in one of the chairs near the window while Mara read it. Helen Marsh wrote that she had been coming to the Aldene branch library since she was 7 years old, when her mother had brought her on Saturday mornings and let her choose any book she wanted, which had been the greatest freedom of her childhood. She wrote that the library had been her companion through a long life, through marriage and work and the deaths of people she had loved and the specific loneliness of old age, when the world contracts and the places that will still receive you become fewer and more precious. She wrote that when she had read the story of what had been found in the building and what was being done with it, she had wept, not from sentimentality, but from recognition, from the feeling of seeing something she had always known to be true confirmed publicly in language she could not have found herself. She wrote that she was 82 years old and had lived a modest life and had not accumulated very much, but that what remained of what she had saved across that long life she wanted to go to something that would outlast her, and that she could not think of anything more likely to outlast her than a building that had already outlasted so much and seemed, at last, to have found the footing it deserved. She wrote that she hoped the money would be useful. She wrote that she was sorry it was not more. She wrote that 60 years of Saturday mornings had given her more than she could calculate or repay, and that this was her best attempt at the repayment. She signed it simply, Helen. Mara set the letter down on the desk and looked at it for a moment without moving. She looked at the room, at the patrons at the tables, each one absorbed in their particular purpose, each one there because the building was open and warm and available without condition. At Danny at the catalog, working through a new acquisition with the focused attention she brought to everything. At Eugenia moving through the stacks with the unhurried efficiency of someone entirely at home in a space they have inhabited long enough to know it without thinking. At the light coming through the windows, clean now, clear, falling on the repaired floors and the filled shelves and the faces of people who needed this place and had found it. She thought about 60 years of Saturday mornings. She thought about a 7-year-old choosing any book she wanted and the specific quality of freedom that represented, the freedom of being told that the best that has been thought and known is available to you, that you are allowed to reach for it, that no one will stop you or require you to prove you deserve it. She thought about Helen Marsh at 82, opening her hand and letting go. She thought about Arthur Harwick at 60, in 1929, doing the same thing. Sitting in a room he had built and deciding that the things he had spent his life acquiring were not finally his, that they belonged to the future, and the future belonged to whoever came through the door. She thought about Eugenia, who had kept the heat on for 41 years, who had given Mara a blanket and a cup of tea and the space to exist without being explained, and who had in doing so made possible everything that followed. She thought about the specific way that generosity propagates, not in straight lines, not in the simple arithmetic of gift and receipt, in widening circles, each act creating the conditions for the next, each person who opens their hand making it slightly more possible for the next person to do the same. Helen Marsh had never known Arthur Harwick. She had never known about the sealed room or the wooden box or the letter written to an unknown future. She had simply come to a library every Saturday morning as a child and found there something that mattered to her, and she had carried that with her for 75 years, and at the end she had given it back. That was how it worked. Not with court rulings and auction houses and $300 million collections hidden behind library walls. Most of the time it was simply this: a woman who loved a place and wanted it to continue. A small act of faith that the thing worth having would still be there for whoever came next. Mara thanked the lawyer and saw him out and went back to the desk. She sat for a long time without doing anything. Around her the library moved through its Tuesday afternoon, ordinary and particular and alive with the specific sounds of people in a place that was doing what it was meant to do. The scratch of a pen, the turn of a page, a child asking a question in a low voice and the murmured reply, the small, unremarkable music of a functioning place. She opened the drawer of the desk and took out her notebook, the one she had been keeping since the early weeks of the legal process, filling it with notes and calculations and the quotations she had copied from documents because they seemed too important to leave unrecorded. She turned to a blank page near the back. She thought about the letter Harwick had written and what it had meant to receive it. The specific feeling of being addressed by someone who did not know you but had trusted you anyway, who had looked at the future and decided it would produce the right person and had written to that person directly, without hedging, without qualification. She thought about what it had meant to her in the moment of reading it, standing in a sealed room with 41 cents in her coat pocket, feeling the weight of being trusted with something she had not asked for and could not have anticipated. She began to write. She did not address the letter to anyone in particular. She wrote it the way Harwick had written his, to whoever would find it at the right time, whenever that was, whoever they were. She wrote that the endowment had received Helen Marsh's bequest with gratitude and intended to honor it exactly as Helen had hoped, by keeping the building open, by keeping the door unlocked, by keeping the heat on for whoever needed it. She wrote that the building was well now, that it had found its footing, that the thing Harwick had believed was possible and Eugenia had maintained through 41 years of difficult faith had come to pass, and that it was going to continue. She wrote about Danny, without using her name, describing only the arc of it, the girl in the driest chair who had come in from the cold and who was now part of the fabric of the place, who would still be here when Mara was not. She wrote that this was how it worked, that the building renewed itself through the people it received, that each generation of people it had helped produced, sometimes, someone who stayed and helped in return, and that this was not an accident or a policy, but simply the natural motion of a place that was doing what it was meant to do. She wrote that she hoped whoever read this would find the building still standing and still useful and still available to the person who walked in without money and without status and without any particular claim on anyone's attention. She wrote that she believed they would. She wrote that Arthur Harwick had believed this too, in 1929, with no evidence and no guarantee, and that his belief had been justified, and that she had read enough of his letters now to understand that his belief had not been naivety. It had been a considered judgment, made by a man who understood human beings well enough to know that some things are maintained not by institutions, but by individuals, not by policy, but by the specific, repeatable decision of specific people to show up. She wrote that she was still learning to make that decision without fear, that it got easier and did not get easy, that she expected it would be that way for a long time and had decided that was all right. She signed it. She folded it. She placed it in an envelope and wrote on the outside, in the same careful phrasing Harwick had used, for whoever needs to read this, when the time is right. She put it in the box behind the desk where Eugenia kept the letters from patrons, which now numbered in the hundreds and came from places far beyond the city, from people who had read the story and felt something they could not quite name but needed to express. The box was nearly full. She would need to find a larger one soon. She looked at the envelope sitting among the other letters and thought about how long it might wait before someone needed it. A year, 10 years, longer, if the endowment held and the building stood and the work of the people inside it continued the way she believed it would. She found that she did not mind the uncertainty of it. She had made her peace with the timescale of buildings, which was not the timescale of people but was not indifferent to them either. Buildings waited because they had no choice, and sometimes the waiting was exactly what was required. Outside, on Marlow and Aldene, the November afternoon was doing what November afternoons do, drawing the light down slowly, turning the air cold and clear, making ordinary things look briefly and specifically beautiful in the low gold of the declining sun. It fell on the limestone of the building's facade, pale and solid, the kind of stone that holds on to cold and gives it back slowly. It fell on the windows that were clean now and let in everything. It fell on the letters above the door, all of them straight now, all of them in their right places, spelling out what the building was in letters large enough to read from the street. Inside, the library moved through the last hour of its Tuesday afternoon. The patrons at the tables continued their work. Danny continued through the catalog. Eugenia moved from the stacks to the desk and back with the unhurried rhythm of someone who had been making this particular journey for a very long time and intended to make it for a long time more. At 5 o'clock, the homework help volunteers arrived for the afternoon session, and a dozen children came through the door in quick succession, filling the tables near the window with the specific productive noise of people working. Mara watched them settle and watched the volunteers move among them and watched the room become, for the next 2 hours, the thing Harwick had imagined when he had written that a library was the only place a person could walk in without money and without status, and find access to the best that had been thought and known. She thought he would have been satisfied, not proud, because pride was a simpler emotion than what she imagined him feeling, watching this from wherever the dead watch from. Satisfied. The specific satisfaction of someone whose bet on the future had been honored. At 7 o'clock, the building closed. The patrons gathered their things. The children left with their homework done, or almost done. The volunteers said goodnight. Danny finished what she was working on and said goodnight. Eugenia put on her good coat and her scarf and her hat with the methodical patience of someone who had been fighting cold weather their entire life, and she paused at the door. She looked at Mara. "Lock up when you're ready," she said. "I will," Mara said. Eugenia left. The door swung closed behind her, and the building was quiet. Mara sat at the desk for a few minutes in the quiet, listening to the building make its sounds. The tick of the pipes. The faint argument of the wind against the limestone. The third board from the top of the main staircase, which still creaked when the temperature dropped. These sounds had been her company for 2 years, and she knew them as well as she knew her own breathing. They were not alarming sounds. They were the sounds of a building that was inhabited, that was being used, that had warmth in its pipes and people in its rooms, and a reason to stand. She turned off the lights in the front rooms and the reference section and the stacks, leaving only the small lamp at the desk. She gathered her coat and her bag. She looked around the room one more time in the dim lamplight. She thought about the wooden box on the reading table in the sealed room. She thought about the letter folded inside it, sealed in its glassine envelope, waiting to be read. For whoever finds this room when the time is right. She thought about all the things that had been waiting in this building, not impatiently, not urgently, simply waiting with the particular patience of things that understand time differently from the people who eventually find them. She thought about Helen Marsh, who had waited 82 years to give something back and had managed it in the end. She turned off the desk lamp. She stood in the dark for a moment, in the building she knew by sound and smell and the particular quality of its silences. She felt it around her, the stone and the wood and the shelves and the things on the shelves and the sealed room and the basement room and the collected letters in the box and the new letter she had written sitting among them. And she felt below all of it the deep patience of a building that has been here since 1921 and intends to go on being here. She walked to the door. She unlocked it from the inside. She stepped out onto the repaired steps and turned and locked it behind her. She put the key in her coat pocket, where the library card had lived for all those months. She stood on the steps for a moment in the cold November air and looked up at the letters above the door. Aldene Public Library. All of them straight. All of them in their right places. The light from the street fell on the limestone and made it look, for a moment, almost gold. She turned up her collar and went down the steps and walked home through the cold, clear night, and behind her the building stood on. The corner of Marlowe and Aldene the way it had stood since 1921, solid and patient and dark now, waiting for morning. The door was locked, but it would open again. It always opened again. That was the whole of it, and it was enough. Spring came to Marlowe Street the way it always came to that part of the city, without announcement, a Tuesday that was cold becoming a Wednesday that was not, the trees along the sidewalk producing their first tentative green overnight, as if they had been waiting for permission. Mara noticed it from the desk, the particular quality of the morning light through the clean windows, brighter than it had been for months, falling differently on the floor. She sat with her tea and watched it move and felt the season shift around the building the way she had learned to feel everything about this place, not as an observer, but as someone inside the thing itself. Ruth, the foundation director, had called the previous evening with news that the city's 3 most vulnerable branch libraries had been formally included in the pilot preservation framework they had spent 18 months designing together. Not saved. Not yet. Nothing was saved until the endowment structures were fully in place and the legal instruments were filed and the funding was confirmed. But included. Named. Acknowledged as worth the effort of saving. That was further than anyone had managed before, and Mara had sat with the phone in her hand after the call ended and let herself feel the weight of it before setting it down and going back to the ordinary work of the evening. David, the trust specialist, had told her once that the most underestimated skill in this kind of work was the ability to receive good news without either dismissing it or over-relying on it. To let it be what it was, a step, a marker, a confirmation that the direction was right, and then to continue. She was still learning this. She suspected she would be learning it for a long time. Danny arrived at 8:50, 10 minutes before opening, which had become her habit. She came in through the back, the way staff did, and went directly to the catalog without being asked. She had been accepted to a part-time program at the community college beginning in autumn, urban studies and public administration, and she spoke about it with the careful, slightly disbelieving tone of someone who has begun to believe in a future they could not previously see clearly enough to plan for. Mara had written her a letter of recommendation. It was the first she had ever written, and she had labored over it, wanting to be accurate rather than merely generous, wanting to describe what she had actually observed rather than what she wanted a committee to believe. She had written that Danny understood instinctively what most people had to be taught, that the value of a public institution is not in what it contains, but in what it makes possible for the people it receives. She believed that. She believed it more completely with each passing month. Eugenia arrived at 9, unlocked the front door, and turned the sign. The first patron of the day was a man Mara recognized, an older man who came every Wednesday and Thursday and worked for several hours at the table nearest the window on something he kept in a thick folder. She had never asked what it was. She did not need to. The library was not a place that required explanation. She thought, briefly, about the letter in the box behind the desk, her letter, the one written to whoever would need it someday. She had not looked at it since the evening she placed it there. She did not intend to. It was not hers to read again. It belonged to the future now, the way the sealed room had belonged to the future for 100 years, and the future would come for it in its own time. She picked up the first task of the morning. Outside, the light continued its slow work across the floor, the same light that had been moving through these windows since 1921, falling on different faces in each decade but falling just the same, steady and indifferent and generous all at once. The way light is, the way this building had learned to be. The door was open. Someone was already coming up the steps. Mara looked up. She smiled. Another ordinary morning beginning in the place where she was supposed to be. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.